views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. I am Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr., and I want to welcome you all here to the Rotunda, to Borough Hall. I am pleased to be with all of you here tonight, not to honor the death, but to honor the life and legacy of Dr. King. We know that during his birthday in January, there are many events throughout the city and the state and this country that honors his life. Today, we are here thanks to the partnership of Judge George Silva and the Bronx Supreme Court justices. Let's give them all a strong round of applause. To take a pause, the same pause that we see happening all over the country. And I know that we have a lot of guests here tonight, but at 6:01 p.m., we will have a moment of silence. 6:01 p.m. was the exact moment that Dr. King was shot and killed in Memphis. I do, however, want to thank my good friend, Reverend Crawford, for being here today. I want you to come up and give us our invocation, and then we'll continue with the program.
Let us pray. Father, as we come to remember Dr. King, his life and his legacy, we thank you, God, for this borough president, his cabinet, and all the elected officials for taking our time to make us pause and stop and think and reflect on this great leader. And in the spirit of Dr. King, we pray that we'll be together in this event. You'll bless this occasion, bless what's being said and done as we think and reflect on your dream. Thank you for your life, thank you for your death, and thank you for your legacy. In Jesus' name, amen.
Let's give it up for Reverend Crawford from Union Grove Missionary Baptist Church. We have worked tirelessly together, Reverend Crawford. I just, again, want to express my appreciation, not only for you being here tonight, but for decades, and understanding that in order to be a good Christian, you have to be a good citizen. And the fact that you and your church have gone above and beyond the call of duty, doing God's work, not only in your temple, but building housing, feeding folks, going out into the community and being an integral part of the conversation to make the Bronx a better place. Let's give Reverend Crawford a strong round of applause. You know, our dads were buddies many, many years ago, and they passed the torch on to us. I don't think we did too bad, Pastor. Again, although we have made many great strides, ladies and gentlemen, we have, for instance, the first African-American woman district attorney in the history of the state of New York, and Darcel Clark with us here. We have with us City Council member Andy King with us here today. We have New York City Civil Court Justice Eddie McShann with us here today. We have New York State Supreme Court Justice Laura Douglas with us here today. New York City Civil Court Justice Kim Adair Wilson with us. Marjorie Velasquez Lynch, District Leader of the 82nd Assembly District. Kenny Augusto, who's representing State Senator Jamal Bailey, a young African-American state senator. And Kenny's also a state committee member of the 78th Assembly District. and so many other judges and so many elected officials, we were able to experience the first black president of the United States of America, and Barack Obama. We have witnessed how in the New York State Assembly, how important it is to have the first black Speaker of the New York State Assembly in Carl Hastie from our borough of the Bronx. I've had the pleasure of serving with someone who we'll hear from in a little bit, but she was my first deputy borough president. Now she is retired. Aurelia Green with us here today. And of course, my partner now, our new Deputy Borough President, Marika Scott McFadden, who's with us here today. Dr. Martin Luther King and all his lessons has enabled us over the last 50 years to make tremendous strides. We have seen judges and lawyers. Once upon a time, in our courtrooms, the only time you saw black and Latinos were when we were on the other side of the bench, being accused of something. And in many cases, wrongfully accused. We have elected officials now. Dr. King fought the civil rights movement, voters' rights. You couldn't even vote at the time. Now we have elected officials, and not only do we have elected officials, but in prominent titles and in prominent places. And sometimes we take that for granted. And sometimes we rest on our laurels. And what we're hoping to do here tonight is to understand the gravity, to understand the weight and the responsibility that Dr. King, at the very young age of 39, we forget how young, how much he accomplished in such a short period of time. 39 years of age, and he was already doing it for over a decade. We think about how, we forget about the loneliness of his leadership. We all revere him, but he was getting hit on the right by racists. He was getting hit from the left, from those who were saying that nonviolence wasn't the way to go, that we got to toughen up a little bit more. He had death threats. His family saw death threats. He was ahead of his time. Let's not forget that when he was down in Memphis, Dr. King had already made that pivot between the civil rights movement and economic rights and economic equality. He was down there fighting for the Memphis sanitation workers who were being mistreated. And when he gave his last speech, and we're going to hear some excerpts after the I Have a Dream speech, when he gave his last speech, which was, I've been to the mountaintop, I think that what he was doing was giving us instructions. And when you hear his words and when you look at his expressions, you see that he carried the weight of being threatened, and he knew that perhaps his life was going to be cut short. Maybe he didn't think that it was going to happen the very next day. But he was giving us instructions, and he was telling us, I may not be there, I may not make it with you, but I know that we're all going to get there together. And in this day and age, when you still see the fact that very poor people who live in the New York City Housing Authority are still going without heat, we still have a lot of work to do. When you see that many of our children in the New York City public school system are being cheated from the right funding and finances so they can have an equal playing field, when less and less of our children are getting into gifted and talented classes or into specialized high schools, we still have a lot of work to do. When you see the invective and hear the invective and the vitriol coming out of the White House and coming out of Congress against women and Muslims and immigrants, and the fact that women are still not being paid the same wages doing the same job that men are doing, we still have work to do. There's a Supreme Court decision that's about to come down that will decimate and devastate unions. And we all know that union and organized labor is the best way to get many of people in our community out of poverty. Again, Dr. King was fighting for the union workers, for the sanitation workers down in Memphis. So when you look at all of this, when you still see that young Black and Latino men who are unarmed are being killed by police officers. I mean, when there's a story of Stephon Clark, which just occurred. It's not anything new. Almost 20 years ago, as a young assembly member, I remember we dealt with this with Amadou Diallo. And so many young boys, whether in New York City or in other parts of the country, have been killed in that span in between. We need to get serious about these topics. We need to get serious about the fact that when you speak of economic inequality, we didn't get too much better. In fact, in some areas, we've gotten even worse than the times of Dr. Martin Luther King when it comes to pay scales and Black and Latinos and women benefiting from booming economies. So when he gets taken from us, and when we commemorate that legacy, when we celebrate his life, I think that we have to do more than just showing up to events. I think we have to do more than just reciting his words, because that last speech that he gave us was him giving us instructions. And so collectively, we have to work together to see where we headed for the next 50 years. We've made strides, but there's still ways to go. We still have not reached that mountaintop that he spoke to us about as a society and as a nation. And here in New York City, we have to start setting the tone. Here in New York, we have to start setting the tone for the rest of the country, in spite of what we hear coming out of the White House. With that said, the Justice George Silva could not be with us here today, but he brought to us someone who has been a true friend, someone who understands how to be firm and fair, someone who has been a mentor to so many of our Black and Latino young boys and girls who need to know what they need to do in order to have and choose a career path in the legal system and become lawyers and judges. She's been the founder of the Thurgood Marshall mock trial sessions that happen right here every year. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Bronx Civil Court Judge Elizabeth Taylor.
I'm really short. Thank you, Mr. Borough President. Welcome on behalf of Justice George Silva, who is the Deputy Chief Administrative Judge for all New York City trial courts and the Interim Administrative Judge of Bronx Supreme Court. Due to a prior commitment, Justice Silva, unfortunately, is unable to be with us here this evening. However, he is proud to partner with Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr. in celebrating the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on this day, the 50th year of his assassination. When most people think of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we think of him as an advocate of the civil rights movements solely for Blacks. However, he was a champion for the disenfranchised, the poor people's movement, and equality for all. Mr. Borough President, thank you for hosting this event to commemorate the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Thank you.
How many of you were around to hear and witness the work and the speeches of Dr. Martin Luther King when he was alive? Raise your hand. So what I would like to do at this moment is bring up the former Bronx Borough, Deputy Borough President of the Bronx, Aurelia Green, to share with us her perspective and some of the things that she witnessed at the time. Madam Deputy, former Madam Deputy, come up, Aurelia. I'm used to calling you Madam Deputy.
I'm gonna stand on the side, but first of all, hello everyone. I'm gonna stand on the side so you can see me. Hint, hint. You have to get a podium that's adjustable for us short folk. That day, I don't think I have ever felt as frightened and lost as I did that day when the news came. And I remember I was in my house and I ran across the driveway to my neighbor and started banging on her door. And I started saying, Dorothy, they killed him, Dorothy, they killed him. It was all she could do to calm me down, because it was something, you heard some talk of him being threatened, but we really didn't expect it. And we didn't expect it, I guess, at that time. It was just so devastating. The rioting, which had already been started, continued that night. And I have to give credit to Mayor Lindsay, because he had started an urban action, what he called the Urban Action Task Force. And that group were individuals who lived in our communities, who were either community leaders or just general people who were interested in their community. And he made them as his team to work with him to help quell violence and to deal with issues of any uprising. And I will tell you, between him and that task force, that's how the peace was kept here in New York City. Because I've witnessed, I remember after one of the riots, and it wasn't after Martin Luther King was killed, it was before he was killed. I remember I live off of 167th Street, and I came to go into the shopping area on Morris Avenue, and it looked like a bombed out zone. It was terrible, because people were reacting to the poverty, they were reacting to the injustice, they were saying no more. And when Martin was killed, it was like all hope was gone, because he was our hope. Malcolm was already gone. They had killed him already. And so Martin was the next one in line to be that source, that strength that we all needed. And when they took his life, it was like we could not understand why this happened, but we did know that racism played a very strong part in it. And for me, as a young woman, as a young mother, I decided that I wasn't going to let this kill my spirit, because I grew up with a very strong grandmother who did not allow anything to deter her, and that's how she taught us. And I was determined to make a difference in my community. And I started working. I started working with the anti-poverty program that President Johnson had started. And from there, you know my history. But I must say to you, and I did get some statistics, because during that time, throughout the country, over 45 people were killed. What else? There were over 2,500 injuries, and over 15,000 people were arrested. We were all right here in New York because our mayor told the police that they were not to shoot looters. He told them not to arrest them if they didn't have to. And it was a big difference in New York City than it was anyplace else. So in Chicago and Washington, D.C., down in North Carolina, it was chaos. The whole country was in chaos. In San Francisco, in Los Angeles, all over the country. And we were the ones who we held our fort. And I am so glad that we were able to. You say that he was before his time. In one respect, he was. But I would say that he was right on time because we needed Martin at that particular time. We needed him to stand up to a system that was racist, a system that really killed our people. And that's what it did. Literally, it killed our people. If they didn't lynch them, they put them in jail for the rest of their lives, and they electrocuted them. But I thank God that we did have a Martin Luther King at that time to help us to strive for and to work for justice. And we did get justice under him. There's a lot more still to be done because the police are still killing our young black men, and we are still on the low totem pole for jobs and everything else. But I'm so proud that here in Bronx County, Mr. Borough President, we have made a difference, and we've shown the rest of the world that blacks are fine in Bronx County because we've got a Darcel Clark, we've got an Andy King, we've got a Liz Taylor. We've got what we need. And the thing is that after serving 27 years in the New York State Assembly, you got me as your deputy borough president. And now you have another soul sister as your deputy borough president. Thank you.
Let's give it up for Aurelia Green. Thank you. Thank you for sharing with us. We've been joined by Davon Harris from Assemblymember Marco Crespo's office. We've been joined by Yaz Duarte from Assemblymember Michael Blake's office. And Maximo Javier is here. He's the Bronx District Manager for Congressman Adriano Espaillat. Madam DA, would you come up and say a few words before? We have a couple of minutes here before the silent moment. Ladies and gentlemen, if there is living proof that the work that has been done has paid off dividends, is the fact that here in the Bronx, we have the first female DA in the history of New York City, in the Bronx, and the first African-American woman DA in the history of the state of New York, our district attorney, Darcel Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Borough President, and thank you to Judge George Silver for having this important moment for us here in Bronx County. It should, it doesn't have to take a lot of planning to get folks together when there's something that's really important that has to be recognized and acknowledged. So I thank you, Mr. Borough President. I have nothing else to say after Deputy Borough President Green got up. And I mean, let's face it, I would not be here if not for the efforts of Dr. Martin Luther King. That's why when I had my inauguration, I had it on Dr. King weekend, because I knew that but for him, I would never have been standing in the place that I am now. So I give thanks to him, and I just want to do what's right. What did it say here? It's always the right time to do what's right. That's what this is all about, and that's what we continue to do each and every day in the Bronx. So God bless us all. Thank you, Reverend Crawford, and all of my partners in government and my former colleagues in the courts. It's a wonderful thing, so let's hear those great words of Dr. King.
Let's give it up for Darcel Clark. We have 1 minute council member, as a young black man, come up and talk to us a little bit about how you feel today. Ladies and gentlemen, council member Andy King.
Thank you, Mr. Borough President. And to all that are here today, I give quickly. I recall the moment that Dr. King was assassinated. I was 5 years old, sitting in my living room. I was being babysat by my bigger cousin. And the news came on, and all of a sudden she started screaming and running around and ran to the phone. Of course, I was terrified. I had no clue what was going on. She called my mother and said they killed him. And I didn't have a clue. So she sat down with me, and as you know, the news was running. And we both sat there because not only that Ken meant so much to us, but as a little kid, he meant so much to me because I shared the same name as King. So I moved around. I was empowered by the name of having a last name King. So when it was taken, it was like someone took an arm from me, took the breath out of me. So I say to each and of us today that we celebrate the legacy of Dr. King. We remember what he did, what he stood for. I ask us all to look inside of ourselves, to understand that this man was an organizer. He was a great father. He was a great humanitarian. And more importantly, he was a great servant of Christ. I ask you, as you move off and listen to these words today, look inside yourselves and find that great organizer in you. Find that great servant in you. Find that great father, mother, sister, brother inside of you. But more importantly, find that great Most High Christ inside of you. And if you can do that, we'll be that much more greater following in the words of Dr. King. God bless you. Thank you, Borough President, for today.
All right, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we're approaching that moment. Let's understand that this was a man of peace, a man who did it in a nonviolent way, who spoke out against the war, spoke out against discrimination and bigotry, someone who fought for the working class, someone who worked for the poor. And so we are approaching that moment. If you could all just join me and stand up and hold hands with the person next to you. We are about half a minute away. Not yet. We're not silent yet, but ready? Not yet. Not yet. Anyway, you all look so beautiful. Thank you for coming here tonight. Soon as we're done with the moment of silence, we're going to go right into the I Have a Dream speech. Again, we want to thank all of the judges for being with us here today. Judge Silver. 1, 2, 3, our moment of silence.
At this time, I have the honor to present to you the moral leader of our nation. I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
I am happy to join with you today
in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize the shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. And the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. They were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to
make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities. Knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friend, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Come on, clap it up, clap it up. Let's clap it up for Dr. King. Do we have the other excerpt? Before we finish out, just a couple of thoughts here, and I have a couple of minutes of an excerpt from his last speech. I really want everyone to know that no matter what you do in life, no matter what your title is or what your financial status is, you can always find your voice. And sometimes it's not about you choosing to do something, it's about the universe and God choosing you and conspiring to put you in a position. I say that because two things struck me in listening to Dr. King's speech. Well, three things. Again, I said he was assassinated at 39 years old, and this was 5 years. 5 years prior to that. He was 34 years old there. And his eloquence and the power of his words. Dr. King never chose to be in this position. Dr. King wanted to be an educator, and all he wanted in life was to be a president of an historical black university. That's what he wanted to be. He wanted to be an educator. There was something in Alabama called the MIA, the Montgomery Improvement Association. And there was an association of black leadership, and they had the new Young Turks, and they had the old guard, Pastor Crawford. And they needed a new leadership, except that some of the old guards wanted their folks in, and the Young Turks wanted to take over, and they couldn't reach some agreement. But there was one person who they can all agree, and it was a young Martin Luther King Jr. When he becomes the head of the MIA, now you get Rosa Parks. When you get Rosa Parks, and you get all of the injustices about not being able to ride in the front of the bus, and she gets arrested, they come to him. He says, you know what, then we'll just do the boycott. When they do the boycott, the media, the cameras are in front of him, and now the world sees this eloquence. And so he was put in the spotlight. One interview started another interview, and so on and so forth. People got inspired by his eloquence and his words, and now you get him to be in this position. The other thing about this speech that I saw is you notice that at the beginning of the speech, he's reading. This speech is known as the I Have a Dream speech. So the portion when he says, I have a dream, that wasn't new to him at the time. He often gave that I have a dream in other places, in other venues, but the organizers of the elders were saying, that's too controversial for this, don't do it. So think about how he was inspired at that moment. He had a script. If you look at it when you get to your places, when you get to your house again, he's reading from the script. The moment that he says, I have a dream, you notice he's not reading from the script anymore. He veered off the script, but we know this speech as the I Have a Dream speech. Sometimes you have to listen to your inner voice, that inner compass, that passion of yours. Sometimes you have to allow for the universe and for God to take his course. And so that was like he said, that was just the beginning. And then think about it. Then once he started in this journey, he believed in it so much, with all of the threats and all of the sacrifices and all of the time away from his children and his family, that he was prepared to go through with this to the very end. If you ask me, it is a scary thought. But think about how that is real freedom. You could see it in his voice. You could see it in his words and his face during the last speech that he gave at the church the night before he was assassinated. When he went down to Memphis from Atlanta, there was a delay on the plane. And the delay was because they had to make sure that they checked all the bags and guarded all the bags because they were already death threats, so they didn't want any bombs on the plane. And then by the time he touched down that morning to Memphis, he received so many threats. And the initial march that they had was one that was not as peaceful as he would have liked. And he was torn by that, and he wanted to stay and continue to organize so that they can show the world that they can march peacefully a couple of days later. He never made it, but that night, I just want you guys to hear an excerpt of the I've Been to the Mountaintop so that you can see.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
He says, I may not get there with you, but I know as a people, we will get there. if we truly love what he stood for, if we truly want to celebrate him, he is not with us. The question becomes, are we going to follow those instructions that he gave us there so that we as a people can get to the promised land? Thank you all. God bless you. And the struggle continues.
We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children.
Leaders in the Bronx came together to remember national hero and civil rights leader, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This year on April 4th marks the 50th anniversary of King's assassination. A screening of King's I Have a Dream speech and his Mountaintop speech were shown at the Bronx County Courthouse. Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr. talks about King's impact to our society.
Hopefully this is part of a conversation to see where are we going in the next 50 years and how is it that we really help with Martin Luther King's dream and get to that mountaintop so that we can have a society that's equitable, a society that's not discriminatory, a society that's not vilifying immigrants and poor people, and ultimately get to that place where the economic scales are balanced.
It's so easy to follow the wrong path, but it's harder to stay the course. So we need to be strong to continue to stay the course. He laid out a map for us. We know what leadership is and what it looked like and what it can mean to a people. So we just have to keep our eyes on the prize and do what's right.
When you talk about Dr. King, for me, it's about how I continue to organize in the way he organized, how I continue to stay active in my neighborhood, how I continue to speak out truth against the injustices of mankind, especially the black in America. How do I continue to be the best father, brother, sister, husband that I can be? Just being the best humanitarian, but more importantly, being a servant of God and follow those words of love, which requires action. It's not a word of lust, it's a word of love. It requires energy and commitment to your brothers and sisters.
50 years later, Martin Luther King Jr.'s words still ring true with power and much conviction. His values were and still will continue to be a pillar for the American dream. For BronxNet, I'm Veronica Guiti.